You've got a dog, or you're thinking about getting one, or at the very least, you think they're pretty great. But rewind 40,000 years, and that same animal was a wolf, hunting the exact same herds your ancestors were hunting, doing it better than they could, with absolutely no investment in whether your bloodline made it to morning. So, how exactly did we end up here? How does a direct competitor for food turn into the thing curled up on your bed right now? The honest answer is one of the strangest turns in the entire human story, and it did not just hand us a pet. It handed us survival. It handed us civilization. It may have handed us everything that came after. Most people who have ever thought about this at all land on a comfortable, tidy version of the story. Early humans were clever, dogs were useful. The two of them teamed up because it made everyone's life a little easier. That version is not wrong exactly, but it drastically undersells what actually happened. This was not a casual convenience arrangement between two species that were already doing perfectly fine on their own without any outside help. This was closer to a lifeline, arriving at the exact moment one particular group of humans needed it most, while a second group of humans, every bit as capable in almost every other respect, never received anything like it at all. Strip away the sentimental framing most retellings lean on, and what remains is closer to a controlled experiment nature happened to run twice on the same continent at the same time under identical pressures. One population gained an ally, the other did not. Everything that followed traces directly back to that single asymmetry, and almost none of it would make sense without understanding exactly how that partnership actually formed, what it actually did for the humans who had it, and what its total absence quietly cost the humans who did not. If stories like this are why you keep coming back to this channel, subscribing just means the next one shows up without you having to go looking for it. 40,000 years ago, none of this was settled yet. Forget the cave paintings for a second. Forget the campfire scenes people like to picture. Think about the actual night. No walls worth the name, no fire that burned reliably till dawn. Just darkness and everything living in it that considered you food. Cave lions, cave hyenas. A short-faced bear built heavier than any grizzly alive today. Every one of them bigger, faster, and better equipped for an ice age than a human had any business being. You were a mid-sized primate carrying a sharpened stick, with night vision worse than almost anything else hunting that same landscape. There was no version of that world where a lone human, or even a small group of them, could reasonably expect to outmuscle, outrun, or outsense the animals sharing that territory. Every physical advantage that mattered in an Ice Age landscape belonged to something else. Humans survived at all, only by being resourceful, cooperative, and, as it turned out, willing to strike an alliance nobody could have predicted in advance. And you were not the only human in that landscape either. Neanderthals had already been living across Europe for roughly 200,000 years before modern humans ever showed up. They were not primitive by any honest measure. They controlled fire. They made sophisticated tools. They buried their own dead with apparent ceremony. Their bodies carried broader shoulders and denser bones, built specifically for cold that would have finished off an unprepared modern human within a single season of exposure to it. On paper, every physical advantage sat with them. They should have been the ones who lasted. Larger brains relative to body size, deep familiarity with the exact landscape they had occupied for millennia, and a toolkit refined over hundreds of generations of trial and error. Instead, they are gone, every last one of them, and we are still here. The real explanation for that gap starts with a wolf making a decision nobody ever asked it to make. It did not begin as a plan. Nobody sat around a fire and decided to domesticate an apex predator on purpose. It began with wolves being opportunistic and humans being observant. Certain wolves, the ones with the weakest instinctive fear of people, started drifting nearer to human camps. Not attacking, not begging, simply existing quietly at the edges, picking off whatever scraps got left behind after a meal. Those particular wolves ate slightly better and survived slightly longer and raised slightly more pups than the wolves that kept their distance. Those pups, in turn, were a little calmer around humans than their parents had been. Run that same loop for roughly 10,000 years, and you get something that had never existed on this planet before. Not merely a wolf tolerating people, but an entirely new kind of animal. Quietly shaped without anyone planning it, specifically built to live alongside us. No one was selectively breeding anything on purpose in the way a modern kennel club might. The landscape itself did the selecting generation after generation, favoring the individuals calm enough to stay close and punishing the ones too anxious or too aggressive to make the arrangement work. Evolution ran the entire experiment on its own timeline, using ordinary survival and reproduction as the only tools it needed. Here is the detail that stops most people cold. Dogs were domesticated more than 10,000 years before any other animal on Earth, before the goat, before the cow, before farming existed in any form. This partnership was never a convenience that showed up once life got comfortable. It was forged under the worst conditions humans have ever collectively faced. Full Ice Age conditions, competing apex predators pressing in from every side, prey large enough to kill you as easily as you could kill it, and no guarantee whatsoever that any given winter would end with your entire group still alive. Dogs did not get domesticated because survival got easier. They got domesticated because survival had never been harder, and something had to give. Every other domestication story humans ever wrote down came later and came easier, after fields were already being planted and villages were already standing in one place long enough to keep animals penned. The dog had none of that comfort available to lean on. It was forged directly inside the emergency, not brought in afterward to make life more pleasant once the emergency had already passed. Most people's understanding stops at guard duty and a bit of hunting help. That barely scratches the surface of what actually happened. Researchers examining massive mammoth kill sites across Europe found patterns that simply cannot be explained by the weapons available at the time. Some sites hold the remains of dozens, sometimes well over 100 individual mammoths, alongside human shelters built entirely out of mammoth bone, kill after kill piling up at the exact same locations across thousands of years, a scale of hunting success that simply does not line up with what a handful of humans carrying wooden spears could plausibly achieve unassisted. A single mammoth represents several tons of muscle, hide, and tusk. A lone human with a spear and no backup has genuinely terrible odds against something that size. A coordinated team of humans working alongside large, powerfully built dogs has something that starts to look like an actual strategy rather than a desperate gamble against overwhelming odds. Dogs would locate the prey first, tracking it across open terrain purely by scent long before any human eye could have spotted movement in the distance. Then encircle it and hold it in place through growling and short charging runs, while the hunters closed in for the kill. Two completely different species, each contributing a strength the other lacked. Neither one capable of pulling off the result alone. A human alone brings intelligence, tool use, and a spear point. A dog alone brings speed, scent tracking, and raw bite force. Neither package, by itself, reliably beats an animal that outweighs a car. Combined, the math changes entirely, and mammoth after mammoth went down at those same repeated locations across generations. The timeline of those mammoth kill sites lines up almost exactly with when dogs first enter the archaeological picture. That is not coincidence. That is arithmetic. More successful kills meant more available protein. More protein meant sturdier adults and more children surviving past infancy. A population eating consistently well grows faster, and that advantage compounds across generations without anyone needing to understand why. A group with a slightly better survival rate this year has slightly more people next year, which means slightly more hunters and slightly more dogs the year after that, a feedback loop quietly reinforcing itself with each passing season. The hunt was only half the equation, though. The other half was the night itself. A predator approaching a human camp guarded by dogs does not get to approach in silence. It gets announced immediately. The people inside wake up ready, weapons already in hand, and the attack either fails to happen at all or fails outright once it does. Ancient humans had essentially no useful night vision, unremarkable hearing, and a sense of smell that barely registered next to anything actually hunting them in the dark. Dogs closed every one of those sensory gaps at once. They reacted to approaching threats before a single human nearby could detect anything. They patrolled the edges of camp while everyone slept. They turned the most dangerous stretch of every single day into something a person could reasonably survive. Repeat that across 10,000 consecutive nights, and the entire survival calculation shifts completely. A single missed warning, one predator that slips close enough before anyone wakes, can end a family line in a single incident. Multiply the number of nights a warning system actually works by every generation that lived through it, and the cumulative effect stops looking incremental and starts looking foundational. There is a practical advantage beyond hunting and guarding that rarely gets mentioned at all, and it belongs specifically to the coldest, harshest environments humans ever pushed into. In the far north, dogs eventually became the only reliable way to move heavy loads across a landscape that offered almost nothing else useful for transportation, food, fuel, injured people. Across terrain, no human could realistically haul supplies over on foot for any real distance without exhausting themselves within hours. Populations that expanded into the most brutal Arctic conditions on the planet did so leaning on dogs, not just as hunting partners, but as the actual engine of transportation itself, hauling sleds loaded with meat and firewood across distances that would have been physically impossible for a person alone, opening up entire regions of the map that would otherwise have stayed permanently out of reach for a species without fur or a natural tolerance for extreme cold. Wherever humans pushed furthest into genuinely lethal cold, dogs were doing work no human muscle could substitute for. Without that capacity, entire stretches of the far north would have remained functionally unreachable for a species without fur, without natural insulation, and without any biological adaptation suited to that kind of prolonged cold at all. Picture two groups of early humans occupying the exact same landscape, hunting the same prey, facing the same predators, sleeping through the same dangerous nights. One group wakes up every single morning slightly better fed, slightly better rested, slightly less likely to have lost a member to a cave lion overnight. The other group does not have that edge. That gap sounds small enough to ignore on any single day. Stretch it across a century, and it becomes significant. Stretch it across 1,000 years, and it becomes the entire outcome. Neanderthals never domesticated a single animal, not one, in the entire span of their existence on this continent. They faced the Ice Age exactly the way they always had, alone, relying on tools, fire, and generations of carefully accumulated knowledge passed down through direct experience, and nothing meaningfully beyond that. Modern humans arrived in Europe carrying something that had functionally never existed before anywhere on the planet: a working alliance with a predator species, a genuine hunting partnership that widened their range, multiplied their success rate, and covered the exact hours when human senses were at their absolute weakest. The Neanderthals were physically larger, stronger, and had occupied the continent for far longer than any modern human population ever had at that point. None of it mattered enough in the end. We had a partner working with us through every dangerous night. They did not. Roughly 10,000 years after modern humans arrived, the Neanderthals were gone entirely, and we were not. Researchers have debated the exact combination of causes for decades: climate shifts, competition for the same limited prey, small population sizes that left little room for error. But the timing of the dog partnership lines up too cleanly with the timing of the disappearance to treat as pure coincidence. One species had an ally working every single night. The other did not, and that single missing advantage may have been the deciding margin in a contest that otherwise looked close to even. Every animal humans eventually domesticated handed us something physical in return, a resource you could measure, weigh, or put to direct work. The goat gave milk, the cow gave labor, the horse gave raw speed. Every single one of those exchanges was, at its core, transactional. The dog gave something no other domesticated animal has ever given, before or since, something that had nothing to do with resources at all. It rewired its own brain to understand us specifically. Point at something across a room, and your dog looks at the object itself, not your hand, not your extended finger, the actual thing you're indicating. Chimpanzees, our closest living genetic relatives on the planet, generally look at the finger instead. Dogs grasp that pointing gesture spontaneously as puppies, with zero formal training required, something even hand-raised wolf pups consistently fail to do at anywhere near the same success rate. Despite an otherwise near-identical upbringing surrounded by the same attentive humans, that comprehension was never something humans deliberately taught them. It is something dogs evolved, specifically, over thousands of years, living directly alongside people, developing a biological sensitivity to human communication that nothing else alive has developed to the same degree. Brain imaging shows dogs have dedicated regions responsive specifically to the human voice, structurally similar in location and function to regions found inside our own heads, a similarity researchers did not expect to find in a species this evolutionarily distant from us. Emotionally loaded sounds, laughter, crying, an angry shout activate a dog's auditory processing and its amygdala in strikingly similar ways to how they activate ours. Dogs are not just responding to the words you use, they are responding to how you feel while you use them. One controlled study exposed dogs to sweat samples collected from frightened people and found measurable stress responses in the dogs themselves. Elevated heart rate, altered behavior, visible signs of unease, while sweat collected from calm people produced no such reaction at all. The dogs were detecting fear chemistry before the frightened person had even consciously registered feeling afraid. For an ancient human trying to make it through a dangerous night, that is not a party trick. That is an early warning system built directly into an animal sleeping within arm's reach, one that reacts to danger and to a companion's own emotional state before conscious thought has time to catch up with either. There is a separate genetic thread in this story worth including, because it shows the adaptation went well beyond behavior and straight into biology. Compared with wolves, dogs carry many additional copies of a specific gene involved in breaking down starch, the kind of gene that matters enormously once an animal starts eating scraps of human food rather than pure meat. Wolves carry very few copies of it. Dogs living alongside early farming and foraging communities carry considerably more, a direct genetic signature of an animal that adapted its own digestive chemistry to survive on whatever humans happened to be eating, whether that was scraps thrown from a hunting camp or grain-heavy leftovers from an early village. That is not behavioral flexibility. That is evolution, rewriting an animal's internal chemistry to match a partnership that had already been running for thousands of years. It shows up almost like a signature left behind in the genome itself, a permanent biological record of exactly how close and how sustained the relationship between our two species had already become long before anyone was capable of writing any of it down. Then there is the piece no other domesticated animal shares at all. When a dog holds eye contact with you, both of you experience a measurable rise in oxytocin, the same bonding hormone released between a parent and an infant, the same chemical underlying trust, loyalty, and the willingness to protect something beyond yourself. Wolves, raised by humans from birth, fully hand-reared and comfortable around people their entire lives, do not produce this same reaction. It belongs specifically to domesticated dogs. They evolved it as a dedicated mechanism for binding themselves to us biologically. A dog did not merely learn to tolerate living near humans. It evolved at a chemical level to be bonded to us. That is an entirely different category of relationship, closer to what exists between a parent and a child than to anything resembling a working arrangement between two separate species sharing the same patch of land out of convenience. One particular archaeological find captures exactly what that bond looked like in practice, in a way that no amount of brain scanning or hormone testing ever could. At a burial site in Western Europe dating back roughly 14,000 years, researchers uncovered a young dog buried directly alongside two humans, laid to rest together as a single unit rather than as separate, unrelated remains that simply happened to end up in the same patch of ground. Careful analysis of the dog's teeth and bones showed it had survived a serious, prolonged illness, one that would have left it desperately weak, feverish, and almost certainly useless for hunting or guarding for weeks at a stretch during its recovery. Someone kept that animal alive anyway, feeding and caring for a sick, entirely non-productive dog purely because it mattered enough to them to bother, and then buried it as a genuine member of the family once it eventually died from that same illness. That is not the treatment of a tool, and it is certainly not the treatment of an animal being kept alive purely for its future usefulness. That is the treatment of somebody's companion, cared for during illness the same way a struggling family member would have been cared for. Ancient humans, roughly 14,000 years ago, were nursing sick dogs back from the edge of death and grieving them afterward the same way they grieved each other, which tells you everything about how deep this relationship actually ran and how far back it genuinely stretches. That single grave sits among the oldest confirmed pieces of evidence anywhere on Earth of a fully domesticated dog, and the emotional weight embedded in it did not need writing, formal ceremony, or elaborate ritual to come through clearly across a gap of 14,000 years. It came through in the simple fact that someone chose to keep a dying, useless animal alive purely because they could not bear to let it go. The dog was there before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before writing, before every other animal humans would eventually domesticate, and every crop humans would eventually plant. It was there before religion had temples, before trade had roads, before any of the institutions we now treat as the foundation of civilization had so much as a name. It was there while we were nothing more than a mid-sized primate with a sharpened stick, trying to outlast a world that had not yet decided we were allowed to survive it. And it stayed anyway. 40,000 years later, its direct descendants are asleep somewhere in your house right now. If you think that is simply a nice story about pets, you are missing the actual point of it. The real point is that without that particular animal, the species likely does not spread the way it did, and civilization very possibly does not get built the way it was. Everything you live inside right now, every part of it, sits downstream of a wolf that was hunting the same prey as your ancestors on one particular night and made a calculation nobody could have predicted. Every city skyline, every written language, every institution built to outlast a single human lifetime traces its lineage back through thousands of generations to a handful of wolves who decided the risk of staying close to a dangerous, unpredictable primate was worth taking. That is the whole story, and it may genuinely be the most important one we have.